The high school auditorium was buzzing with the kind of chaotic energy that only happens on a Friday night. It was the annual talent show, the biggest event of the spring semester, and the place was absolutely packed. Every single seat in the house was taken, from the front row where the proud parents sat with their cameras ready, to the very back row where the cooler, older kids slumped in their seats, looking like they had better places to be. The air inside the hall was thick and warm. It smelled like a mix of cheap popcorn from the concession stand, the faint scent of floor wax that the janitors had used that afternoon, and the sharp, metallic smell of microphone wires. The huge velvet curtains on the stage were a deep red, slightly faded from years of use, and they hung heavy, hiding the backstage area where nervous students were pacing back and forth. The lights overhead were dimmed just enough to make the stage glow, creating a spotlight that waited for the next victim or star. You could feel a sense of restlessness moving through the crowd like a wave. It was that specific feeling of a room full of people who were ready to be entertained but were also secretly waiting for something to mock. High school can be a tough crowd, and everyone knew it. The first half of the show had been a mixed bag. There was a girl from the 10th grade who sang a pop song, but she was so nervous that her voice shook, and she forgot the words to the second verse. The audience had been polite, clapping gently to save her feelings, but the energy in the room dipped. Then there was a magic act performed by a boy who wore a top hat that was too big for his head. He tried to pull a rabbit out of a hat, but the rabbit refused to move, and he ended up just holding up a grumpy-looking animal while everyone giggled at the awkwardness. It was fun, but it wasn't exactly what you would call high-stakes drama. The mood in the room was casual. People were whispering to their friends, checking their phones under the dim lights, and crinkling bags of chips. It felt like just another ordinary school assembly where the main goal was just to survive until the bell rang. Then, the intermission ended. The house lights, which had been slightly raised so people could find their way to the bathrooms, flickered and dimmed again. The chatter in the crowd slowly died down, turning into a low hum of anticipation. The principal walked out from the side of the stage. He was a man who usually looked serious and tired, holding a clipboard in one hand and adjusting his glasses with the other. He stepped up to the wooden podium, tapped the microphone twice, sending a sharp thumping sound through the speakers, and cleared his throat. "All right, everyone, settle down," he said, his voice booming slightly too loud because the sound technician wasn't paying attention. "We have one more special act before we move on to the final judging. This is a student who has never performed here before, but he asked very politely for a spot on the lineup." A murmur rippled through the students. New acts were rare. Usually, it was the same group of drama kids and choir students signing up year after year. The principal looked down at his clipboard, squinting a little at the name written there. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second, as if he wasn't quite sure how to pronounce it or if he was even allowed to say it. The silence stretched out for a moment, making the audience lean in. "Please welcome Elias," the principal announced, his voice echoing off the back walls of the gym. He turned and walked off the stage, leaving the microphone standing alone in the center of the spotlight. The name Elias didn't mean anything to most people in the crowd. It wasn't a name you heard on the morning announcements for sports or academic awards. It was a name that felt distant, unfamiliar. You could hear people whispering all over the auditorium. "Who is Elias?" someone asked a few rows back. "Is he a transfer student?" another person whispered. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from bored curiosity to a sharper, more alert kind of interest. In a high school setting, the unknown is often dangerous. When you don't know someone, you don't know if they are going to be cool, or if they are going to be weird. and in this environment, weird was what people were hoping for. It was more entertaining. The silence grew heavier, and hundreds of eyes locked onto the side of the stage, waiting to see who would walk out. For a few long seconds, nobody came. The curtain didn't move. The silence became awkward, the kind where you could hear a single cough from the balcony and the sound of the air conditioner humming. A few students near the front let out quiet laughs, nudging each other and making jokes about whether the guy had chickened out and run home. The tension was building, tightening like a rubber band. Nobody knew it yet, but they were about to witness something that would flip the entire night upside down, shattering their expectations and changing the mood of the room forever. But for that moment, they were just a crowd of impatient teenagers, waiting to laugh, sitting on the edge of their plastic seats, ready to judge whatever came next. Finally, the heavy red curtain on the side of the stage moved, and a boy stepped out into the bright spotlight. The first thing the audience noticed was that he didn't look like he belonged on a stage at all. Elias walked with a kind of nervous shuffle, his shoulders hunched forward like he was trying to make himself invisible. He was wearing a faded, oversized t-shirt that hung loosely off his frame and a pair of jeans that were frayed at the bottom. His hair was messy, falling over his eyes, and he kept looking down at his feet as if he was counting the steps to the center of the stage. He was carrying an electric guitar, but it wasn't the sleek, shiny, brand new instrument that the rock band kids used. It was a heavy, old-looking thing with chipped paint and stickers peeling off the body. It looked like something he might have found in a dusty attic or bought for $20 at a garage sale. A thick, black cable dragged behind him on the floor, twisting around his legs like a snake. The crowd watched in silence for a few seconds, sizing him up. Then, the whispers started. You could see heads turning together as people leaned toward their neighbors to ask who this was. He didn't have the confident swagger of the popular kids, and he didn't have the polished look of the choir students. He just looked awkward. He looked like someone who would much rather be anywhere else in the world than standing under those hot lights. Elias reached the center of the stage and placed his guitar on a stand. His hands were shaking visibly. Even from the back row, you could see the nervous tremor in his fingers as he reached for the amplifier to plug in the cord. He fumbled with the jack, his fingers slipping on the metal. It took him 3 tries just to get the plug into the socket. A low ripple of giggles moved through the student section. It wasn't hateful laughter yet, it was just the uncomfortable reaction people have when they see someone struggling. But to Elias, standing alone on that vast wooden stage, it must have sounded like a thunderstorm. He froze for a moment, wiping his palm on his jeans, then reached over to turn on the amplifier. He turned the knob a little too far. Suddenly, a sharp, ear-splitting squeal blasted from the speakers. Screech! The sound was high and piercing, cutting through the air like a knife. Half the audience jumped in their seats, and a few people actually covered their ears with their hands. The sound guy in the back booth looked panicked, frantically waving his hands, but the noise didn't stop immediately. It hung there, ringing painfully, before Elias, looking terrified, quickly twisted the volume knob back down to 0. The silence that followed was broken by a burst of loud laughter. This time, it wasn't just a giggle. It was real laughter. The tension of the squeal had released, and now everyone found the situation funny. The popular kids near the front row were laughing the hardest, pointing at the boy who looked like a deer caught in headlights. Even some of the teachers cracked smiles, though they tried to hide them behind their hands. Elias looked up, blinking against the spotlight. His face was turning a deep, bright red. You could practically see the heat rising from his cheeks. He looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. But he didn't run off the stage. Instead, he bent down to pick up his guitar. He put the strap over his shoulder, but it was too long, and the guitar slipped down, hitting his hip awkwardly. He had to hold it up with his left hand to keep it from falling to his knees. He tried to step closer to the microphone stand to introduce himself or maybe to start playing, but he had forgotten about the long black cable lying on the floor behind him. As he took a step forward, his sneaker caught right in the middle of the wire. For a second, time seemed to slow down. Elias stumbled forward, his arms flailing. He didn't fall flat on his face, thank goodness, but he stumbled hard, tripping over his own feet and nearly slamming into the microphone stand. He caught himself at the last second, grabbing the mic stand to steady himself. The stand wobbled dangerously, tilting toward the edge of the stage before swinging back upright with a heavy thud. That was it. That was the breaking point. The entire auditorium exploded. The laughter was roaring now. It was the kind of loud, echoing laughter that fills a gymnasium and bounces off the walls. It was merciless. The students were howling, stomping their feet, and slapping their knees. It was the classic flop moment they had been waiting for. The awkward kid on stage, the terrible sound check, the trip over the cable. It was perfect comedy for a high school crowd. Elias stood there, clutching the neck of his guitar, breathing hard. He was frozen. He looked out at the sea of faces, but he couldn't see anyone clearly because of the lights. All he could hear was the sound of hundreds of people laughing at him. Not with him, but at him. He looked so small up there, just a silhouette against the bright backdrop. A few people in the back began to shout things. "Get off the stage!" One voice yelled, though it was partly drowned out by the noise. "Play it already!" Another person screamed mockingly. The mood had turned hostile. The audience had decided, in those few seconds, that this was a joke. They had decided that Elias wasn't a musician, he was the punchline to a joke they hadn't heard yet. The poor boy looked down at his shoes again. He adjusted his grip on the guitar. The laughter was starting to die down just a little bit, turning into expectant murmurs. Everyone was waiting for him to do something. They were waiting for him to run away in tears, or maybe to mumble a sorry and walk off. It felt impossible that the show could go on. The energy in the room was so heavy with mockery that it seemed like the only way out was for him to leave. But Elias didn't leave. He just stood there, his knuckles white as he squeezed the neck of the old, battered guitar. He took a deep, shaky breath that puffed out his chest for just a moment. The crowd grew quiet again, watching him like hawks, ready for the next mistake. They didn't know it, but they were about to stop laughing permanently. The laughter didn't die down. In fact, it seemed to grow louder and wilder, feeding on itself like a storm that refuses to break. It was a raw, sharp sound that echoed off the high ceiling of the auditorium and bounced back down to the stage. To Elias, standing there under the blinding white spotlight, it must have felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. He was just a kid, alone on a vast wooden platform, while hundreds of his peers pointed and jeered. For a solid 10 seconds, the room was absolute chaos. The popular group in the front row was having the time of their lives, one of them slapping his knee repeatedly, tears of mirth streaming down his face. It was cruel, but in that moment, it was just a game to them. They saw a mistake, a clumsy error, and they reacted with the instant instinct of a pack. They didn't see a human being standing up there, they saw a live comedy sketch. The mockery was written all over their faces: smirks, raised eyebrows, and open mouths. They were waiting for the grand finale where he would trip again or drop the microphone, giving them one last reason to roar. But Elias didn't move. He didn't run away, and he didn't try to fix the cable. He just stood there, frozen like a statue. His knuckles were gripping the neck of the guitar so tightly that they had turned completely white. He was staring straight down at the scuffed floorboards, seemingly unable to look up at the wall of faces in front of him. He looked incredibly small. The oversized t-shirt hung off him even more now that his shoulders were slumped in defeat. The battered guitar looked heavy, dragging him down toward the ground. The laughter began to slow down, not because anyone felt guilty, but because the silence of the boy on stage was starting to feel awkward. It was no longer fun to laugh at someone who wasn't fighting back or making a funny face. The energy in the room shifted from loud mockery to a tense, uncomfortable waiting game. The murmurs started up again, a low buzzing sound that filled the gaps between the fading chuckles. "Is he just gonna stand there?" someone whispered loudly from the left side. "Maybe he is crying," another voice giggled. The audience grew restless. People started shifting in their seats, the plastic creaking under their weight. The mood turned ugly. A few impatient students near the back began to stomp their feet on the metal bleachers, creating a rhythmic, clanging noise. Thump. 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 It was a signal for him to get off the stage. They were done with him. He had had his chance, he had messed up, and now they wanted the next act. Even the teachers in the front row looked uncertain. The music teacher, who had been smiling politely before, now had a furrowed brow. He looked toward the side of the stage, as if checking if the principal was coming to rescue the poor boy. But no one came. The curtains on the side remained still. It was just Elias and the crowd, locked in a painful stalemate. Elias took a shaky breath. You could see his chest rise and fall rapidly from the back of the room. He looked terrified. His knees were actually knocking together slightly, a tiny tremor that was visible despite the distance. Every instinct in his body must have been screaming at him to drop the guitar and run into the safety of the wings. It would have been so easy. Just one step backward, disappear behind the red curtain, and the nightmare would be over. He could go home, hide under his blankets, and never come back to school again. That is what 99% of people would have done in that situation. But he didn't move an inch backward. Instead, he slowly shifted his weight. He lifted his head just an inch, enough to show a flushed, sweat-streaked face, but his eyes were still cast downward, focused on the strings of his instrument. He was shaking so badly that it looked like he was vibrating. The crowd sensed something shifting. The stomping stopped. The murmuring faded away. It was that weird, magnetic silence that happens when people realize something unexpected is about to happen. The joke wasn't over yet, and the boy wasn't leaving. Why wasn't he leaving? Was he going to say something? Was he going to get angry? The anticipation hooked everyone. The air in the room grew heavy and still. You could hear the air conditioning humming in the background and the soft rustle of programs being folded. Elias lifted his right hand, the one that was dangling by his side, and brought it up to the guitar. His movement was slow and deliberate, like he was moving through thick water. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He wasn't looking at the judges. He had tuned out the hundreds of people waiting for his failure. In that moment, it looked like he was the only person in the world. He adjusted the strap on his shoulder one last time, pulling it up so the neck of the guitar angled upward. He wiped his palm on his jeans again, leaving a dark streak of sweat on the denim. The front row of students, who had been laughing so hard a minute ago, was now quiet. They were watching his hands with confused expressions. The smirk had vanished from the face of the boy who had been pointing. Everyone was leaning forward, waiting to see what this awkward, terrified boy was going to do. He looked so fragile. It seemed impossible that he could possibly recover from such a disastrous entrance. The narrative was already written in their minds: he was the clumsy loser who tripped on a wire. But as he stood there, shaking and breathing hard, there was a sudden change in his posture. His back straightened just a fraction. His jaw set tight. He wasn't looking at the floor anymore, he was looking at his instrument with a strange intensity, like a soldier picking up a weapon before a battle. The silence stretched out, long and thin, until it felt like the room was holding its breath collectively. It was the kind of quiet that hurts your ears. Then, finally, Elias moved his fingers. He didn't reach for the microphone to apologize. He didn't make a joke, he simply pressed his left hand down on the fretboard and positioned his right hand over the strings. He was going to play. Against all odds, with the entire school waiting for him to fail, he was going to play. The moment Elias's fingers touched the strings, the entire atmosphere in the auditorium shifted. It wasn't a slow fade, it was an instant snap, like a light switch being flipped off. He didn't start with a gentle strum or a polite tuning note. Instead, he struck a single, powerful chord that rang out through the speakers with a clarity that cut through the air like a knife. The sound was deep, rich, and full of emotion. It didn't sound like the amateurish noise they expected. It sounded like a cry. For a split second, the silence was so deep that you could hear the ventilation system humming in the walls. The laughter that had been roaring just moments before vanished instantly. The boy in the front row who had been pointing and jeering froze, his hands still in the air, his mouth hanging slightly open. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of sudden confusion. He looked at his friends, then back at the stage, trying to process what was happening. Elias didn't look up at the crowd. His eyes were squeezed shut, his head tilted down toward the fretboard. He seemed to disappear inside himself. The shaking that had taken over his body only moments before had stopped. His left hand moved along the neck of the guitar with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone who had just tripped over a cable. His right hand strummed and plucked the strings in a complex rhythm that sounded like rain falling on a tin roof, followed by a rumble of thunder. The music wasn't a pop song. It wasn't a cover of a famous rock band that the students could sing along to. It was an instrumental piece, original and raw. It started slow and melancholic, a winding, sorrowful melody that seemed to tell a story without using a single word. The tone of the guitar was clean, without any fancy effects, but the way Elias bent the strings made the instrument sound like it was singing. It was a sound that was achingly lonely. People in the audience stopped shifting in their seats. The girl who had been checking her phone in the back row slowly lowered it, her thumb hovering over the screen, her eyes locked on the stage. The teachers, who had been preparing to intervene if the boy ran off crying, exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even the sound technician in the back booth stopped adjusting the knobs, leaning forward in his chair to watch the monitors. As the song progressed, the tempo began to pick up. Elias moved his hand higher up the neck of the guitar, playing fast, intricate runs of notes that blended together in a blur. It was technically difficult music, the kind of playing that requires years of dedicated practice, hours spent alone in a bedroom while everyone else is at parties or playing video games. He hit every note perfectly, there was no hesitation, no fumbling. The boy who looked clumsy on his feet was a wizard with his hands. The tension in the room changed completely. Just a minute ago, the tension was hostile and mocking, fueled by the thrill of embarrassment. Now, the tension was born of pure awe and shock. The audience realized, with a dawning sense of embarrassment, that they had been laughing at a master. The joke wasn't on Elias, the joke was on them. They had judged a book by its cover, and they had been completely wrong. Elias began to pour more energy into the performance. He was no longer standing still. He was swaying slightly with the rhythm, his foot tapping out the beat on the stage floor. He looked like a completely different person. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by an intense passion that was almost frightening to watch. It was as if he was pouring all his loneliness, all the times he had been ignored or bullied, into the music. The guitar was screaming now, a high, piercing solo that echoed off the walls of the gymnasium. The popular kids in the front row sat motionless. They looked at each other with nervousness. It's a strange feeling to realize that the person you were making fun of is actually better than you at something, especially something as cool as playing the guitar. One of the boys crossed his arms, sinking lower in his seat, trying to look unbothered, but you could tell he was uncomfortable. The laughter had died in their throats, replaced by a lump of guilt. The music swelled, filling every corner of the huge room. It felt like the sound was wrapping around the audience, squeezing the air out of their lungs. It was beautiful, but it was also sad. It sounded like a soundtrack for a movie where the hero overcomes impossible odds. The complexity of the melody was dizzying. He weaved bass lines with treble melodies, creating layers of sound that bounced back and forth between the speakers. By now, the entire auditorium was mesmerized. You couldn't hear a single whisper. No one was coughing or moving. The only sound was the guitar. It was a stark contrast to the noisy, chaotic environment of just a few minutes ago. Elias was in the middle of the stage, bathed in the spotlight, completely lost in his own world. He wasn't performing for them anymore, he was playing for himself. And that honesty was what hit the crowd the hardest. He hit a series of descending notes that tumbled down like a waterfall, slowing the pace down again. The intensity dropped, bringing the song back to the quiet, melancholic melody from the beginning. It was a gentle, humbling sound. The anger of the fast solo had faded into a deep, resonating peace. It felt like the end of a long journey. The audience was holding its collective breath, afraid that even a cough might break the spell. They weren't just watching a talent show act anymore, they were witnessing a moment of pure truth. The awkward boy was gone. In his place was a musician of rare talent, and the silence that filled the room was the sound of hundreds of people realizing they had made a terrible mistake. Elias's fingers came to rest on the strings, muting them instantly, but the sound of the final note seemed to hang in the air like a ghost. It was a deep, resonating vibration that echoed off the back walls of the gymnasium, refusing to fade away. For a long moment, he didn't move. He stood with his head bowed, his hand still clutching the neck of the guitar, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion. The amplifier gave a soft, low electrical hum, the only noise in a room that was suddenly completely and utterly silent. It was a different kind of silence than before. Earlier, the silence had been filled with tension and mockery, a vacuum waiting to be filled with laughter. This silence was heavy. It was thick with respect and shock. It felt like the entire auditorium was holding its breath, afraid that if they let it out, the spell would break. 500 people sat frozen, staring at the stage. No one checked their phones. No one whispered to their neighbor. The air felt charged, like the atmosphere just before a thunderstorm breaks. Slowly, Elias opened his eyes. He blinked a few times, adjusting to the bright spotlight that was still shining directly in his face. It was as if he was waking up from a deep sleep and suddenly realizing where he was. He looked out at the crowd, but his expression was confused. He seemed surprised that they were still there, surprised that they were quiet. He looked down at his guitar, then back at the audience, his face flushed and sweaty. He didn't say anything. There was no thank you and no bowing to the crowd. Instead, he quickly pulled the strap over his head and fumbled to put the guitar back on the stand. His hands were shaking again, the magic of the music fading as the reality of his surroundings rushed back in. He gave a quick, awkward nod to the room, almost like he was apologizing for taking up their time, and then he turned and hurried off the stage. His walk was fast and clumsy, a sharp contrast to the confident, soulful figure they had just watched. He disappeared behind the heavy red curtain before anyone could make a sound. The stage sat empty. The microphone stand stood alone in the light, and the old guitar sat silent on its stand. The silence stretched on for another 5 seconds. 10 seconds. It was so quiet that you could hear the sound of a car driving by outside the building. The audience was stunned. They were processing what they had just witnessed. The narrative they had built in their heads, the narrative of the awkward, weird loser, had been completely shattered. In the span of 4 minutes, they had gone from judgment to awe, and their brains were struggling to catch up. Then, a single sound broke the stillness. Clap. It came from the left side of the room, near the front. An older teacher, the one who taught history and was known for being strict, stood up. He didn't clap politely or slowly, he clapped with force, his hands smacking together sharply. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Another sound joined in. Clap, clap. A girl in the third row stood up. Then a boy in the back. It started slowly, a scattered rhythm of applause that felt hesitant at first. But within seconds, it picked up speed. The sound grew louder, spreading from the few to the many. It wasn't just clapping anymore, it was a roar. The entire room seemed to surge upward as people stood up from their seats. The applause was deafening, a wall of sound that washed over the empty stage. It wasn't the polite applause you give to a friend who tries their best. It was the kind of thunderous, screaming appreciation you give to a rock star. But amidst the cheering, something else was happening. If you looked closely at the faces in the crowd, they weren't just smiling. They were wiping their eyes. The laughter from earlier was completely gone, replaced by a sudden, sharp sting of emotion. It started with the girls in the choir, who understood the technical difficulty of what Elias had just done. They were crying openly, tears streaming down their faces because the music had been so beautiful. But it spread to the rest of the school, too. The football players, the quiet kids, the parents, everyone felt it. They weren't just crying because the song was sad. They were crying because they felt guilty. The realization hit them like a physical weight. They had laughed at this boy. They had pointed fingers and sneered at his discomfort. They had judged him by his oversized shirt and his scuffed shoes and the way he tripped on a wire. And in return, he had given them something incredible. He had taken their cruelty and turned it into art. He had shown them that he was deeper, stronger, and more talented than all of them put together. Down in the front row, the group of popular boys who had started the laughter stood motionless. They weren't cheering as loudly as the others. One of them was looking down at his sneakers, his face red. He felt a hot, burning sensation in his chest. Shame. He remembered how hard he had laughed just 5 minutes ago, and now the memory tasted sour in his mouth. He realized that Elias hadn't been the joke, he had been the joke. He had been the one who was small-minded and mean, while Elias was the one with the giant soul. He swallowed hard, fighting back the strange urge to cry himself, and finally put his hands together in a slow, respectful clap. The noise in the auditorium reached a peak. It was a chaotic mix of whistling, screaming, and clapping. The principal had to come back out to the microphone just to calm everyone down. He looked out at the crowd, his own eyes shining a little, and held up his hands for silence. But the cheering kept going. People didn't want to leave. They didn't want the moment to end. They wanted Elias to come back out, to take a bow, to hear how much they loved him. But he was gone. He had slipped away quietly, leaving behind only the echo of his guitar and a crowd of people who would never look at the quiet kid the same way again. As the applause finally began to die down and people started to shuffle toward the exits, the mood in the room was fundamentally changed. The cynicism and boredom of the night had been replaced by a sense of shared humility. As the students walked out into the cool night air, they weren't talking about the girl who forgot the lyrics or the magic trick with the rabbit. They were talking about Elias. And they were talking about how wrong they had been. It was a lesson learned in 5 minutes of music, a lesson about not judging a book by its cover that they would remember for the rest of their lives.